Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Tuesday Times Roundtable. I'm very happy to introduce today's two moderators from FIU's Office of Student Conduct and Conflict Resolution. First, Devin Parra is an assistant director with the office, or both assistant directors with the Office of Student Conduct and Conflict Resolution. Devin has served in this role for just under a year, and in this role, he's responsible for adjudicating student conduct cases involving behavioral misconduct. In addition, he serves as the chair for the Admissions Clearance Committee, which is responsible for reviewing applicants who have disclosed legal or behavioral misconduct on their applications to FIU, something that's incredibly relevant to today's roundtable discussion. The committee then provides a behavioral recommendation to admissions on the applicant. Prior to being here, Devin worked at FSU in the Office of Student Rights and Responsibilities, but is a proud two-time graduate of FIU, obtaining his bachelor's and master's degree. And Amanda Ogisi, I haven't pronounced that yet. Ogisi. Amanda Ogisi is assistant director of in the office as well, and she serves as a hearing officer, adjudicating student behavioral misconduct cases. She manages FIU's Civility Initiative and Know the Code campaign, as well as the university's Student Conduct Committee, which, if I can editorialize, there are all the programs that get students involved with the conduct process, including exuding values and things that prevent misconduct from happening. So great things that you as students can be involved with. She also creates, plans, and facilitates a variety of trainings and presentations to students and staff on civility. Prior to her position at FIU, Amanda spent 5 years working as a resident director at the University of Maryland College Park. She received her master's degree in higher education administration at FIU and her bachelor degree from the University of South Carolina. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you. Oh, I love it when I get claps before we even do anything. That's like my favorite part. All right, I'm going to grab this clicker, I think. All right, so what is Ban the Box? And so we're going to go, Devin and I are going to kind of go back and forth between these slides depending on the content, and we'll chime in on each other's stuff. But Ban the Box is essentially a campaign that was started by a group called All of Us or None, and it's a national civil rights movement of formerly incarcerated people and their families. The campaign challenges stereotypes of people with prior convictions and asking employers to choose the best applicant based on their qualifications and not necessarily their history. And so primarily what they're looking at is asking that employers remove that question of the application. So when you apply for a job, it asks, like, have you ever, do you have any criminal history? Do you have any criminal cases pending, that type of stuff, and asking that they remove that question from the application, and rather than asking it during the initial application, that they ask that question later in the application process. So once they've interviewed the person, once they've decided that they want to offer them a position, they can ask the question at that point through a background check or something like that, but at least giving the individual a fair shot from the beginning.
Good job.
All right.
All right, so kind of going off of what Amanda just mentioned, when we talk about Ban the Box, we're focusing on some key areas. So the first area is going to be, like Mandy mentioned, record searches. So when we look at applications, sometimes we see a box that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Have you ever been charged? Basically, at that point, you'll have to disclose if that's ever happened to you. What happens is typically what this movement is trying to prevent is from applicants to be disqualified or looked at in a different light because they've checked off that box. The idea is that we're going to be looking at the applicant for the qualities they bring, for the experiences they have, as opposed to focusing just on that criminal history. And again, when we talk about criminal history, this can be as back as 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. So really, it's in many cases, it's history that's following these applicants that they can't really ever change. When we talk about expungement laws and how we can expunge records, it's really limited as to what can be expunged or what can be expunged. So that's important. When we talk about Ban the Box, we're looking mostly at employment. Amanda today will talk a little more about in the state and what legislation has been proposed to looking at post-secondary institutions, so specifically us here at FIU, in terms of what questions can we ask of our applicants when they're applying to FIU, and why. We'll talk a little more as why it's important, we think, in terms of a safety perspective of what are we looking at in terms of admissions requirements and what we're not looking at, and we'll definitely share that as well. And one of the big reasons that this movement is taking place, or what's contributed to this movement has been the war on drugs. So we're seeing a lot of individuals who are either being released for drug crimes or have been charged for drug crimes, and how that's impacted them in terms of seeking employment. So you see here a line that says that in a nation where 1 in 3 working age adults has had some sort of involvement with the law and law enforcement. So we're talking right here, at least 33% of our population has had some sort of interaction with law. So that's why it's important, this movement. We'll talk about what different states have done and how we're trying to get ahead of the curve really in terms of making sure everybody has a fair opportunity, both post-secondary as well as employment-wise.
Yeah, and then I also want to mention that as we go through all of the slides, so our main goal out of this presentation is we're going to share with you all a lot of information and context around this movement, and that's really only going to take about the first 20 to 30 minutes of this presentation, and the rest of that is really meant for us to, we have some questions for you all to kind of facilitate discussion and get you all engaged in this conversation as well, so that we're not just talking at you for an hour.
Yeah. So when we look at different arguments, really what we try to do today is bring about different areas and what everybody has contributed to this movement. Like Mandy said, this has been over the series of years that this movement has begun to take really full steam. And what we're looking at, first argument is that the Ban the Box will assist in increasing employment for people with criminal records. So the idea is that without asking this question or looking at this at the time of an offer, that we're giving everybody the opportunity to bring their qualities forward, to state why they're good for the position, and get you to the point of receiving some sort of offer for employment. Another argument that's been made, and this one was actually brought up by the National Bureau of Economic Research, is Ban the Box will lead to employers making race-based assumptions about who is likely to have a criminal record. When we're talking about that, we're looking at the possibility that employers are looking at your name. So, what your name looks like. Is it possible that you are, a Hispanic male, right? So it's more likely than not that you had a criminal record. So what we're doing is, this argument is based stating that with Ban the Box, we're showing, hey, this person doesn't have a criminal record, move forward through the process, as opposed to saying, well, I think that it's possible they have some sort of involvement with, the law or whatnot. So that's one of the arguments that was made from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Another argument that was made was mostly applies to public sector jobs. And this, again, something that we'll bring up in our presentation is a lot of the policies that are being brought forward nowadays and what states are doing is for public sector jobs. So the private sector really can roam as they please. If they want to consider that at the time of application, they can do so. If they don't want to consider it at all, they can do so as well. But there's really, the majority of this legislation is going towards public employers and not the private sector. So how do we get the private sector more involved to comply by this? But how are some private sector jobs actually trying to get ahead of the curve and saying, well, we're going to look at things a little differently and we're going to make a determination how we want to evaluate someone's past. So that's definitely important to note today. Next argument, Ban the Box only delays a criminal background investigation and does not necessarily remove an individual's criminal record from the hiring process. Essentially stating that even if it's not being considered at the time of the application, you're still going to consider it at one point. You're still going to find out that I had a DUI. You're still going to find out that I had a possession of some sort of drug. You're still going to find this out at one point, and you're still going to take that into consideration, right? So that's another argument that's mentioned. And the last one is talking about delaying employee start dates. So already now, when you're going through an interview process, it could take weeks from your phone interview to your final round. You could be meeting with committee members, so we're balancing schedules. And now we wait this whole process, and at the end, now we're going to do this background check that could take 3, 4, 5 business days. So now we're delaying these employees from being able to go out in the workforce, be able to work on a specific project. I think one of the things I read while preparing for this presentation was, if I need someone to hang drywall, I can't wait a week on a project to hang drywall because I need that done tomorrow. That's why I'm trying to hire them so quickly. So again, talking about the positives and negative effects with this movement. So like I mentioned, when we talk about the different states, what we did was we highlighted some of the states that have some sort of policy in reference to Ban the Box. And again, this is presented by the National Employment Law Project. So we have 33 states, District of Columbia, and over 150 cities and counties that have adopted fair chance policy or Ban the Box. So closest to Florida, we're looking at Georgia. Miami-Dade and Broward County have adopted policies like this. It is for the public sector. So we have some movement, at least locally, with references. But really, the next state above us is Georgia. You're going to see that mostly the West Coast. California is a state that you'll see throughout the process is very much involved with Ban the Box. The state of Massachusetts is another state that was pretty much at the forefront of this movement. But really, that's where you're looking at. So you're looking at the Northeast and the West Coast that are really participating in this movement. And again, mostly for public sector jobs, but there are some areas that are focusing on the private sector. Los Angeles, for example, is an area that's focusing on the private sector. We'll also talk about some companies and how their owners or their upper level management, their experiences led them to be a part of this movement. So here we are. So anybody ever eaten Dave's Killer Bread here? Dave's Killer Bread is absolutely great. So when I'm thinking about this topic, started researching, okay, who's possibly doing this? So Dave's Killer Bread is actually one of those companies. They are a private company at this time. And it's really based off Dave. Dave's the owner of the company. A little more history on Dave, and I was trying to look at it today and say, how did we get to this point? So Dave actually had previous run in terms of assault. We had, I think, last thing I saw, he had about over 30 charges. So you're talking about substance abuse. So dealing with substance abuse that led to, again, burglary, assault, just you name it, this individual had participated in it. His family in the past had a small bakery. And basically when he got out of jail, his brother apparently picked him up and said, hey, we're going to put you to work here. And really through testing out different types of bread and working with just kind of getting creative, that's how we get to Dave's Killer Bread. So you're talking about someone who basically comes out of jail, not really sure what to do, gets involved in the family business, and really grows his family business. So what the family business was before is no longer Dave's Killer Bread. So it's not like he walked out and just walked into Dave's Killer Bread. He made that brand for himself. So that's important because we're talking about someone who really kind of picked himself up and really had to turn things around. What he did on the back end is now, I believe, almost 30% of their labor force has some sort of previous criminal record. And again, if you look into that after today's presentation, you'll see that their intention is not just focusing on the population that has come out of, who has a previous criminal record. They're really looking at their best applicants, and it's fine if they have a criminal record or even if they don't. So again, 30% of that force is with some sort of criminal past. And I think recently they sold the company, I believe back in 2015 or 2016, for a lot of money. So it's a testament to that company in terms of really giving second opportunities. Dave's Killer Bread actually does have a foundation that works with other private sector companies to continue to promote this movement and make sure they're giving fair opportunities in their hiring process. So when we talk about 11 states that have mandated the removal of conviction history, we're looking at California, Connecticut, Hawaii, again, some of the states that we already highlighted. And again, you'll probably see like Washington, Oregon, again, more on the West Coast, and then Massachusetts and New Jersey, again, in your Northeast.
So how does this affect our campus? On our application for admissions, we have an admissions clearance committee, which Devin will talk a little bit more about. But on our application for admissions, we ask 3 questions, which I'll get into on the next slide. But those questions are basically asking students about their prior history before they come. Once a student answers yes to one of those 3 questions, their application is automatically placed on hold by admissions, and they are sent over to our office. Our office then requests certain paperwork or documentation from them based on how they answered the question, and their application essentially can't move forward until they have submitted the required documents to our office, and Devin and his team on the admissions clearance committee review it, and they make a recommendation to the Office of Admissions. So what does the Admissions Clearance Committee want to know? They ask 3 questions. Have you ever been subject to disciplinary action, or are you currently or have any disciplinary action or charges pending at an educational institution for behavioral misconduct? So that is whether that be in high school, if it's like a new freshman applying, or someone transferring from another institution, or someone coming from community college who just finished their AA and they're now trying to come get their bachelor's. Did they ever receive any behavioral misconduct charges? So were they in any fights? Did they ever, possess drugs? Or, did they ever get in trouble with the school, for lack of a better term, trouble? I don't really like to use that. But, did they get in trouble with the school for behavioral reasons? The other question is, have you ever been charged with or convicted of a criminal offense, or are you currently the subject of any criminal proceeding? Our university makes that question very broad. I've seen other schools that will ask about the criminal piece, and they ask only specifically about felonies, or they ask only specifically about whether or not you've been convicted, right? So if you were charged but the charges were dropped or something like that, you went no pros, you don't have to disclose that at certain institutions, or you only have to disclose if it's a felony. But at FIU, we're very broad in that question, right? So anything that you've ever had, except for minor traffic violations, if you were charged with something, if you were arrested, if you went to court, we're expecting that students disclose that on their application. And then the last one that we ask is if they have any disciplinary charges previously or pending from an academic institution for academic misconduct. So cheating, plagiarism, those types of things. And with that, it currently is housed under the Academic Integrity Office, but that is slowly but surely moving over into our office, so that our office will be reviewing files and documents from all three of these questions. Right now we only review the first two, but eventually pretty soon we'll have all three of them.
Right, so when we talk about the admissions clearance process, what are we looking at specifically? So in terms of your academic requirements, so your SAT scores, ACT scores, GPA, that's not something that we're reviewing. Now, we do encourage our applicants that when they create personal statements to include that, right? To include about how you're involved in the community. If you're involved in honor society, specific groups, tell us a little more about that. What it does is it allows us to really get that perspective for the student in terms of why FIU is important to them. Again, we don't meet with the student, so our committee wouldn't be, the student wouldn't come in front of a committee and present their case or their previous behavior. But in that personal statement, that's where we're going to get their perspective. All right. So again, we send recommendations just for behavioral. So again, like Mandy mentioned, either be behavioral misconduct at a previous institution, or let it be legal misconduct, so any previous legal record. Again, at any point, it's not a specific range. We typically tend to look within 7 years of the review date. But if it's longer than that, we still consider it. But 7 years is typically what HR standards are for looking at from an employer's perspective. So we try to be consistent with that. In terms of our admissions clearance committee, some individuals that sit general counsel, so our attorneys for the institution, do sit in that committee. FIU police, so a member of their upper administration sits on our committee. University housing also sits on our committee as well. Enrollment services, counseling psychological services, undergraduate education. Am I missing anybody? As well as members from our student conduct team. And again, the idea is to get a full committee to give perspective. Everybody comes from their specific functional area, so they're seeing an applicant from different areas. So I think it's important, when we're reviewing police reports, to get a perspective from legal, get it from FIUPD. If they're providing any information about substance abuse, that's important for CAPS to review. Individuals are trying to live in housing, we're looking at those behaviors and see if housing, is really at this time the best place to be living at. So we want all those campus partners to give input. Now that's important because it's not just one person making a decision, it's our committee looking at it. So again, that's our admissions clearance team. In terms of behaviors that we've seen anything from drug possession, DUIs are cases that typically will auto clear, so we'll get the documentation and make a decision from an administrative perspective. If it's anything that involves DUI manslaughter or anything like that, that might go more towards a committee. So anything with violence, anything with drug distribution, sexual misconduct, anything of that nature will be reviewed by our committee. And at that time, our committee will make a determination. What is important to note about this committee is just because you have a previous criminal record does not mean that we will not recommend you for admission. Okay, that's also many conversations I have with our applicants say, well, I disclosed this, so now I'm not going to be accepted. Well, that's false. We definitely are about giving opportunities. We think, obviously, we would love to have as many students as possible at FIU. We think it's a great institution, a great opportunity. And it's important to note that people make mistakes. right? And it's how we build off those mistakes and how we bounce back that I think is really what's a true test of character and shows what your future outlook looks like. So again, anything that just because you have a criminal record does not mean that we want to make it to the institution, okay? And again, all of our decisions are just recommendations, so the Office of Admissions has that final call on that. Stipulations that we've asked of applicants, not be able to live in housing, so typically drug charges, cases of theft, those are typically behaviors where we'll send a recommendation for no housing. Anything outside of that, so DUIs, we do allow you to live on campus. If you had cases back in, freshman or sophomore year of high school, you got into like a small fight, a small argument, that's something that will still allow you to live in housing. Okay. So again, anything with physical violence, theft, or drug, it could lead to a stipulation of no housing. Outside of that, we typically will send a positive recommendation. We could ask, if the case happened recently and you're still working through your court programs, we could ask you to complete those court programs just to show that you've completed your whole process and that case is closed. As well as we could put a conduct probation. So basically follow up during that maybe a 1-year time that you're not in good conduct standing with the school. If you have no cases, it runs itself out, and then you're back to good conduct standing. So there's different stipulations that we can apply. And again, the idea is to allow as many applicants as possible to continue through the process. We are step 1 in the process. Step 2 is to be reviewed by your academic standards. So again, we want to be able to push you forward through the process. We try to run numbers in terms of, at least in 2018, what our numbers have looked like. Only 4% of the applicants we've reviewed have actually received a negative recommendation, so a recommendation of deny. Again, that's less than 20 applicants from the pool that we review that has been recommendation denied. That could be anywhere from felony probations that are not completed yet, cases of violence, manslaughter, anything of that sort, distribution of drugs, something like that could lead to a recommendation of deny. But again, our intention is to have a very low number, again, preferably 0, in terms of denying applicants. We'll talk a little more, if you like now, about the future changes for admissions clearance process. So talking about ban the box, talking about some common factors like looking at criminal records only on the back end. So again, reviewing them, in this case, for their academic standards. What we're trying to do is get to a place where applicants are being reviewed for their academic standards first. So if you qualify, you're admissible to the institution, then we'll look at any past criminal history. Okay. I think that what we're trying to do is get to a model where it's similar to employment, where we're reviewing you first for what you bring to the table, what type of candidate you are, and then we'll look at that criminal piece. Okay. So again, that's something that we're transitioning to right now. It's still in the works. It's not effective yet, but we're hoping that by next year we'll have that all rolled out and definitely be consistent in terms of with employment, also being consistent from post-secondary wise.
And one of the things I want to make sure to just emphasize on, even though Devin has mentioned several times in terms of the recommendation that we make to admissions. And so I just want to be really clear about that in terms of it is a recommendation from our office. So our office doesn't decide who gets admitted into the university. We do make a recommendations to admissions, and they're the ones that have the final say. And while I would say it's probably accurate that the admissions office does look at our recommendation, they can still choose to deny somebody that we recommended for admission, and they can also still choose to admit somebody that we recommended for denial. It doesn't happen all of the time, but it has happened a couple of times in the past and can. And so I think that's a really important thing to emphasize, is that we make a recommendation, but our office isn't the final decision maker in the process. It really is, kind of a collaboration between us and admissions.
Yeah, and I think just to add on that, when we talk about our admissions clearance process, we try to be as transparent as possible. So if you go actually on our conduct website, you'll see basically step-by-step what we ask of you, what potential behaviors could lead to specific types of recommendations. So we try to be as transparent with the process. It's not that we just hide a committee in the back room, do our recommendations, and move on. We definitely try to be as transparent as possible. And again, if an applicant has questions, we will try to give them as much information as possible so they're aware of what's going on. Okay, and again, just to add on the reference to admissions clearance, it meets once a month. So the idea is that we build a caseload, again, for our committee to review. And our applicants are always informed through the process of where they stand in their review.
So we've talked a little bit about this whole, from the employment standpoint and this question about prior criminal history for employment. And we've talked a little bit about how a prior criminal history or prior, behavior misconduct at an institution can affect admission into the university. But how do those things connect? Like, why are those things relevant and important? So there was a state bill that was presented at the beginning of this Congress term session, which is like a month. Like I don't know. They don't work at all in this state. I'm not sure. That's a whole nother presentation, y'all. But it was state Senate Bill 702, which was preventing, basically what they were proposing was for criminal history records and applications for public employment and admissions to public post-secondary and educational institutions. So that would count us. That would count all of the SU state university system schools in the state of Florida, basically saying that all jobs cannot ask the question until after the application process. So once they're ready to make an offer is when they can inquire about criminal history, and that for higher education institutions, we can't ask the question ever. Okay? And so whereas employment would have that remedy that they could ask the question in the later process, for those seeking admission to a post-secondary educational institution, the university would not be able to consider criminal history at all in the applicant that's seeking admission. So what happened? That state bill or that Senate bill died in Government Oversight Committee on March 10th, 2018. A very similar bill, just the name was different, but everything else was the same, was submitted prior to this year. So in 2017, the same bill was submitted. It died in committee on May 5th, 2017. Some versions of this bill have been presented into state Congress even before 2017, and it's anticipated that in this coming election or this coming year in 2019 session, it'll likely be presented again. So while it hasn't gone anywhere in the past, it does continue to be introduced into the legislation, and there's this conversation for us in higher education institutions, particularly people that do the work that Devin and I do, about what happens if this bill were to get approved. And what does that look like for us in our profession and for our universities and our campuses? Again, this is just public schools, so private schools would not be affected by this. So, one of the things, so that's kind of where we are, right? In terms of, we haven't really answered that question for ourselves, right? Because we hasn't gotten to a point, hopefully, where we need to. But these are just some thoughts and some questions for you all. So before we go into the questions that we have for you all, I would like to know first, does anybody have any questions for us about information that we've presented? Or comments? So, what we want to know from you all in terms of trying to get some discussion and a dialogue going is, what are your thoughts in general on this legislation overall, both from the employment side and from the educational side? What do you think about it? It's good, bad, neither here nor there, you don't have an opinion? Yeah.
Well, to begin with the private sector, I kind of agree with generally with Ban the Box. I did understand your example with if I need somebody for a certain job quick. But yeah, I feel like people should be given a chance to make their claim or stake, and then to have their criminal past reviewed second. Because those people also, they need to live as well. And if you don't give them a fair chance of life, their chances of going back into crime increase a bit. And then, I'm sorry, I'm pretty nervous. And then on the education side, education's a little more complicated because there's this idea that education should be available for everybody, but there are safety concerns and health hazards, you know. So I'm not sure yet about the education side, but about the private sector, I do feel that generally speaking, someone should be allowed to first go through an interview process and then at the end have that question pop up.
Thank you. Yeah, back up.
To be honest, I think that when it comes to opportunity, there are certain things that you cannot just take for granted. I have this idea that I used to think that education was for everybody. It was this beautiful thing that you can just give away like water, and everybody would just clear the thirst out of it. And it's not like that. People, it's hard to study. It's hard to get a book and sit down and actually read it and get out of it. And I don't think there's people that have the discipline for it. I don't think there's people that have that kind of part of it. And to be honest, sadly, I have to say, wherever you come from, it's part of who you are. So usually these kinds of people that just come out, in jails and stuff like that, they don't have kind of the, discipline or determination to kind of go at it. They don't kind of understand the world, So I think there's not really a thing of excluding them. I think there's just a disconnection between what comes to after they go out and after they go in, I think there should be more some sort of preparation or some sort of litigation in terms of when they are in the jail, where are they going to be? Where are they going to see themselves? Where do they actually want to get to? Because if not, then it happens what we are, that they just go into the public sector, and that's pretty much how it goes, And we don't want that. We want them to create jobs, to do as this guy did with the bakery, like he did his own stuff, and he created jobs, and he went into a way, but he knew what he wanted, he knew he put this discipline into himself. So there needs to be that connection between that little gap,
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is like maybe a little bit more, which I think is a much larger conversation about the status of our incarceration system as a whole, but saying a little bit more on that rehabilitation part when prisoners are incarcerated, so a little bit more preparation and help and more intentional preparation for when they are released from prison to help them acclimate a little bit better to society, whether that be going to school or going into employment or whatever the case may be. Okay.
And I think to add to that, kind of what you mentioned, so we have seen, even in this line of work, individuals who, while they are incarcerated, they're going, GED programs, maybe trade schools, and it really depends, obviously, in terms of the system that you're in, so the state and what funds what resources are being put into individuals when they are incarcerated or in that system.
State
But
prison, federal prison, private, there's just a whole
correct.
slew of differences.
Right, and I think also too when we're talking about individuals who may have a criminal record, there's really, obviously ban the box is really specific to checking off that you had a previous history, but it ranges anywhere from one offense to 30, 40 career of crimes, right? So I think that's also plays into opportunity to attend. Obviously in some cases, unfortunately, there is that recidivism rate where couldn't get a job and ended back in either associated with the same individuals that got them in those situations in the first place, or really just trying to make ends meet, let it be a substance addiction or whatever it may be. So in terms of kind of what Manny mentioned, those resources being pumped into the jail system and in terms of incarceration, what are those resources that need to be placed in order to prevent this recidivism rate and allow them to, again, come back to either post-secondary institutions or public or private sector?
You had your hand up, yeah.
One thing that really strikes me from reading the article is that it talks a lot about traditionally like low-skilled or menial or really low-paid jobs like dishwashers and servers, which is why I think it is ban the box on job applications particularly is kind of a very initial first step to reducing the disparity between prison populations and reducing the discrimination against marginalized communities, because it's a big part of the school to prison pipeline and the discrimination against marginalized communities that they're denied access to education, and the prison process significantly limits their earning potential. So what you were talking about with rehabilitation in prison, and I think universities have to play a big role in that, in making sure that people with criminal records have fair access to higher education, because that's the only way that criminals and people with criminal records can actually eradicate that difference between them and the general population, because it's not just access to jobs, it's access to education, earning potential, and it can follow them throughout their lives.
Yeah, and that's absolutely one of the biggest arguments around this legislation in general or in this movement is, and that's actually one of the questions there is, is asking about prior criminal history either on an application for a job or an application for a university. Is it further marginalizing a certain population and the ability of people to kind of get out of this cycle of, prison if they are not receiving resources to better educate themselves or grow themselves. And so I think kind of going off of that, so we talked about like in general, the next question is asking, the first question is just your thoughts in general, but more specifically to universities. And when I say universities, I mean public four-year institutions, right? Because that's mainly what would be affected by this legislation, right? So not community colleges or trade schools, but schools like FIU, UF, FSU, those types of larger four-year public institutions. Do you think universities should ask? So there's the second and the third question. The second one is saying prior criminal history specifically. So just criminal history. Do you think universities should ask about that? And then we'll go to the next question. Yeah.
I personally think that they should. I think it should definitely be taken into consideration on a case-by-case basis. And I know we weren't going to focus on like community colleges, but from my personal experience, I did transfer here from a community college, and it was like open admissions. So no matter your criminal history, you could get your education there, and I think that's a good thing overall. Being able to start at a community college if you have a previous conviction. But in my personal experience, there was someone on campus who had a previous conviction for a sexual charge, and he was harassing students on campus, including myself. So they had to restrict him to one campus. They had to move him from one to another campus. So I think it's a good idea to generally let people who previously been convicted into community colleges first as like a pathway. But I don't know if it's really okay to say this, but in terms of money, like there's a lot more money put into public institutions. We already have a high dropout rate in general. So, I know like over half of people here do have aid of some sort. So it is important to take into consideration how likely a person is to drop out or to be convicted of another crime.
Eric?
I want to respond to the idea of using the criminal history as an indicator of academic success, which came up twice. And I think that's the part of it that's tricky or dangerous. I think that the first part you mentioned about this person was harassing you and other people, that where this comes into play should be to try to make sure there are no safety concerns and that this individual is not going to victimize people on the campus. I think to say that a person may or may not succeed academically because of this type of history is not something that should really come into play, because they still have to meet the academic standards. So so if somebody met the academic standards to get admitted by admissions, I'm not aware of evidence to say that a criminal background would reduce that, and like you said, a lot of people don't finish anyway. FIU's four-year graduation rate, which is not low for its peer institutions, is 30-something%. So it seems a little arbitrary to say, we're going to try to say that,
But I do. So I do want to emphasize further, like a case-by-case basis, and in terms of universities, not just one conviction, but like, do you have a pattern of behavior? Is this multiple convictions, and is it like substance abuse related? I think that's important too, because a lot of people do have, like you were mentioning earlier, have convictions because of substance abuse problems, and if those are recent or not. If the person has cleaned up and they're highly functioning in society, then that shouldn't be an issue.
You had your hand up right here.
I feel like it's going to be very difficult to make an all or nothing rule. I think, as you said, it's going to have to be case by case, what type of conviction, and there's going to have to be resources put into reviewing them.
Yeah.
I believe that that there should be some restrictions, but we also shouldn't completely deny someone with criminal education, with criminal history education. Just as like you would create a personal statement during the job application, perhaps it could also be you have to create a personal criminal history statement when applying to a university that is an essay or something describing your history, what you have done so far to recreate yourself after getting out of prison, after being convicted, and what you hope to do in the future, and what promise that you have to give back to the university.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add on that and just kind of comment on what everybody else had mentioned is when we, like, what we mentioned was about that safety piece. Now, I think what's important to note is that just because you have a criminal past doesn't mean that you're a safety or a threat, right? But when we mentioned the case-by-case basis, what are those behaviors that we're reviewing, right? Someone who got, arrested for 2 grams of marijuana is going to pose a much different threat than someone who has a manslaughter or multiple manslaughter charges. When we're talking about pattern of behavior, so I was very happy that you mentioned that. We're looking at that too, right? And I think that's where the discrepancy lies, where we automatically say, well, you have a criminal past, and it's a no-go. But like you mentioned, if you give us a personal statement, if you give us a final charge of disposition where you're talking about the nature of the behavior, well, based on that conversation and what you're writing, I can gauge what your interest is and why FIA is important to you. And I think that's what's important to know is this should be mostly a case-by-case basis. To your point, there is no perfect law. It's really hard to say, we're going to make this law, but then we're going to review it case by case. So it's really important that we continue to give, whatever law is developed, continue to give that opportunity for both institutions to take that safety assessment and see what type of risk that person can pose to our campus, but also at the same time being open to allowing individuals who have a criminal past to apply and succeed at our institution. Because I think if we did research on that, we would show that a lot of them probably could succeed here on campus.
I just want to throw out into this conversation, because everyone so far is talking from the assumption that the individual with the criminal background is somehow different than people who don't have one. One, that a lot of people are convicted falsely. And 2, that a lot of people are convicted for things like drug possession and DUI that other people that have not been caught are not convicted of. So whether it's a false conviction.
That are doing, but are not.
Right.
Yeah.
So whether the person did do a crime but just happened to be caught, or whether they were wrongly convicted, which I believe happens a lot. It's important not just to see this as education, as an opportunity for these individuals who have wronged, but to think that there's literally nothing other than bad luck between that person and the institution. And I would even say, if the person writes in these essays we're talking about, I didn't do it, FIU should welcome that sort of thing too, because that could be true.
I think it kind of running that a little bit, sorry for jumping in there. But when we talk about also the discrepancy in terms of what individuals are asked of, so, we look at individuals who accept plea deals, and it's really if you go to trial, you can get up to 10 years in prison, and it's really not going to be, that is a possibility, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And people really get scared and say, listen, I can't afford this attorney to come to a whole trial. Let me just go ahead and just take this deal. Also, when we look at probations, you have a case where an individual might get a 1 year of a misdemeanor probation, but you have someone who serves 6 years, right? So there's discrepancies there as well. And I think what's important to know is that when we get those cases, we automatically take to the committee because we can acknowledge there's some sort of difference here. We've had cases in the past that had this, but now we're seeing something completely different, much more severe. So I think that's a great point that you mentioned.
I want to go to this question, and then I'm going to go to the woman in the striped shirt back there. Go ahead.
As of right now, I'm not believing to believe something else. I believe that based on companies hiring individuals and asking this question, yes, it kind of has some sort of relative to the matter, because I don't want someone that could possibly just be showing up late or missing work multiple times. But I don't see the reason why a education system as a university would ask students about the criminal history stuff. Because if it's a safety issue, then I think there's other things that we have to worry about based on safety, because I commute to school and I noticed that there's multiple ways to get out to school, one with a gun and just shoot up the school. Yes, fine. But so what is the reason that we ask people?
I think one of them is safety. That is part of it. There's also the opposite argument on that. I think someone can also argue that a lot of students that come into our office, right, for violation of the student code of conduct probably didn't have a criminal history before they came here, but they were still enacting behaviors that were making the campus unsafe. And so I think you can argue that stance from both parts. I think, though, when someone has a prior criminal history, I think as we, as a society, begin or are continuing to become very wanting to point fingers and hold people accountable when something bad happens, and the more polarizing that we're becoming as a society, and the more that universities are being expected to prevent every single little thing that could ever possibly go wrong on a university's campus, I think it makes administration a little bit more leery of certain things, right? And so with your example, right, if someone came onto campus with a gun and they decided to, start shooting people, if it came out that that person had a prior criminal history and had all of these other things going on, and that the university knew about it and did nothing, now the university is facing this whole liability. And while it may be really jaded, to kind of think that from a university standpoint, we also have to think about the fact that people are going to look at FIU and they're going to blame FIU, regardless of whether or not it was something that FIU could have controlled. We could have done every single little thing right, and this would have still happened. People are still going to hold us accountable, right? And it's still going to blame us, and in the media it'll still kind of. And so I think some upper level administration get to become a little bit more leery around that, right? In terms of, if something were to happen. So I think that's part of the safety issue. I think from the other standpoint of it, I think one of the reasons that we're asking the question is not just about the criminal history, but the next question, right, is asking about behavioral academic misconduct, like previous behavioral academic misconduct at another institution. And I think that's also something, I think the reason that we're asking that question is we want to see how the student has performed in a prior educational setting. And how did they behave in that setting? And so, for example, for us, if a student comes to us, is here at FIU and they're found responsible for, sexual assault, and we suspend them, another SUS is more than likely not going to take them during that suspension period, because if they were suspended from FIU and FIU decided that they probably shouldn't be on that campus, then chances are they probably shouldn't be on another college campus. They shouldn't be at UF. And so at least until the suspension period is over, right? Once that suspension is limited, then the student is welcome to return to FIU, and so then they can return to another institution as well. And the same thing goes for plagiarism or cheating, right? If a student is academically dismissed from an institution for plagiarism or for cheating, I think a university will want to know that if they're taking that into consideration for admitting the student. You had your hand up.
You brought this up before, prior to the questions for discussion, when you had explained the legislature passed by the state senate in regards to asking questions about previous criminal records. I wanted to know, because you didn't really expound upon it, and I don't know what your level of insight would be into this issue, but what would you anticipate FIU's response to be if such legislation were to be passed?
I didn't expand on that. That's one of the things I was trying to get at in terms of right now our office, who is in charge of this process of handling the process when students answer that question. I don't think we've really come up with what our response would be, even though it has come up in the legislation a couple of times. Every time it dies, and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And so right now, all we're doing is kind of keeping an eye on that legislation, making sure that we're aware of it when it's being presented again so that we can keep an eye on it. I think that we probably wouldn't come to a plan of what we're going to do or how we would handle it until it's actually passed and it's something that we need to worry about. Yes?
I guess just to follow up from what he said about, there's no difference between someone with a criminal record and someone without a criminal record except luck. It's not just luck, because there are
some cases.
No, I just mean there are certain populations that are predominantly, sent to jail for certain crimes, like people from lower income backgrounds, like, ethnic minorities, like the prison system is usually class and race based. So
absolutely.
When it says that, it does ask about prior criminal record further marginalized a certain population, I think there are lots of different considerations that are given to people from lower income backgrounds in terms of things like applying for funding, in terms of even like extracurricular activities. That people take into account the fact that they might be from a less stable household or they might have faced more challenges. So I'm wondering if FIU does anything to address that, because obviously they look at things on a case-by-case basis. So I'm not suggesting that there should be some kind of like affirmative action in place to like, you know, but I think there needs to be some way to like compensate for that, given how skewed the criminal justice process can seem to be.
Sure, I'll actually, in reference to, I think this is where that personal statement becomes so important. So for example, I'll talk to you about when we have cases where individuals are talking about substance abuse. It could be something that they saw as when they were growing up in their home, and then we take into consideration. So for example, in the cases where there was a pattern of substance abuse, or they're indicating that, or they're basically disclosing that, we're not asking them to disclose that. We're looking at, you know, what type of follow-up are they receiving right now? Are they attending AA? You know, if they're attending NAA. So it shows that, yeah, that there was this behavior that I am currently coping with, I'm currently dealing with, but here are the steps that I'm taking. And I think that's where the biggest thing with our committee is, where we're going to give you that opportunity. Now, it's the applicant is who's sharing that, right? We can't go out and say, okay, were you dealing with substance abuse or anything, that we can't ask those questions. But I think when an applicant comes forward and shares that, I think our committee needs to weigh that, because they're trying to give us perspective of what they've gone through, and why education is so important for them, right? And in a lot of cases, those personal statements indicate, this is what happened, this is what my past is, what has been identifying me for so long, this is what I want to do, this is what my next step looks like. And I think that's something that our committee heavily weighs, outside of obviously reviewing the behavior, but I think it does show light, and it shows really that the applicant is stating, hey, this is where I want to be there.
Yeah.
And that's really important for us to weigh.
But the main issue is that, and this is something that they obviously partially can't address,
Mm.
there are things like the fact that, like, you know, people from upper middle class, like white households, probably wouldn't be convicted in the first place for that, and would have to kind of provide evidence that they're doing something about that.
Mm.
But there's also the fact that, like, a lot of these services are more easily available to, like, people in higher classes, and also, like, people, like, a rich person who gets convicted for a drug offense is going to have access to, like, a really fancy detox place, like, they're going to spend time, like, sitting by the pool, like, chilling. Like, obviously, rehab isn't easy for anyone, but, like, it's the same thing as the prison system. People, higher class families will get access to nicer prisons. Like, everything's going to be very, very stratified on every level. So I'm wondering if that's part of what you take into consideration.
Sure, I mean, yeah, it's a lot more difficult, obviously, to consider. I think also even rewinding back to before they even get, you know, the case gets adjudicated, and we're talking about defense, right? So typically, if you come from a more affluent background, you're going to have your own private defense. Who's going to be one attorney who's assigned to you, as opposed to a public defender who has a caseload of 100, 150 cases, and now they want to defend you the same way they're going to defend someone else. And I think that's where we also see discrepancies in terms of sentencing, right? So how much jail time they're serving, what their probation looks like. You could see those discrepancies, and I think that's definitely considered, again, to an extent. But I think the biggest thing is the behaviors we're really looking at. I think the sentencing, if it was a case that happened 5 or 7 years ago, right? If you have no other cases, then you've shown a pattern of behavior to show that you've turned the corner on that, right? But I think you do bring up a good point. And yeah, it is difficult at times, of course.
Yeah.
Just to bring up a point of conversation, let's say somebody does go to the criminal justice system and they get out of the criminal justice system. To those that deem that they shouldn't be allowed in education in the current job market, that further and further requires education and qualifications, how are they supposed to find a life for a decent job, so to speak? And do you think them not having a chance, I'm not saying a guarantee, but a chance of education them not having would increase their likelihood of going back into crime? Because what I'm trying to reach is a way to prevent the continued pathway of criminal behavior. I don't think just excluding these people completely after they go through the system would be beneficial at all to society. I think that would cause more harm and increase the likelihood of them going into crime. Also, I don't believe that it shouldn't, the far extreme that it should not be considered. Yes, it should be considered, but this is a very touchy subject.
I'm going to go with the woman in the back who hasn't had a chance to speak, and then I'll give you an opportunity to speak.
I do think that universities should ask about criminal record, but in regards to most criminal records, I feel like are irrelevant, like drug charges and DUI and things like that. But like you brought up a really good point. She brought up a really good point about sexual assault. People like that, I wouldn't feel safe being around somebody like that. And I think a lot of women agree. And thankfully, FIU has a lot of great resources, counseling, the Panther safety tram, and like I'm really grateful for all those things, but it sucks to have them because there are people who abuse and assault people because they think, I don't know. So I feel like somebody who has engaged in that kind of criminal history, they definitely have to go through a lot more barriers and maybe not even be allowed, because I don't think it's just like, you know, an abuser, and with all the things happening right now, with universities not really taking responsibility with, you know, like Brock Turner and all of that, how they don't really take responsibility for things that happen on campus. It's just a bit worrisome, and I feel like for me, anything else is fine, but that is the only thing that I would just not be okay with.
So maybe, like, you think it's fine to ask a question, but that, you know, to maybe just restrict, you know, from more serious offenses, not from like the asking the question more so to just to find out or get to know at the more serious offense and not necessarily the the minor
for
ones.
me, I see like you can justify stealing, like, okay, you're hungry and you needed to eat. You can justify a drug charge because you were just unlucky. You had a gram of something and you were unlucky to get caught, but I don't see justification for beating somebody up or sexually assaulting them. So I feel like that's just, you need to be punished a little bit harder for that.
All right, I'm going to go to this young lady and then I'll let you speak.
So with regard to his question, I mean, I personally think that we should be even more lenient with jobs than with education, because everyone needs a job. We need to work. I think in most cases, previous criminal history really doesn't affect your ability to work. With regard to education, what I like, you know, is the current system where a lot of community college, they have open admissions. So you can go to a 2-year institution, get your AA with a, you know, with a previous criminal history. You can prove your academic interest, and then a university could review it. But like with regard to our current policies, I mean, I even think that's pretty strict. I think that moving to a, you know, like taking into consideration time since conviction, like have you been convicted of a crime in the past 3 years, and or do you have multiple convictions? And then differentiating, like she said, between violent and non-violent offenses, because a lot of drug charges, like I said, unless you have an ongoing substance abuse problem, a lot of times it doesn't affect your ability to achieve. And even with regard to previous violent history, like I said, we do have like this zero tolerance thing going on, but I think it's really important to take in consideration how long ago it was, because we need to really consider people do have an ability to change. People do, you know, many times people do learn from their mistakes and they want to do better and they want to create a good future for themselves. So I think it's important to take in consideration how long ago a violent offense was and how much of a risk they pose currently.
All right, thank you. And I agree with you, men too.
Men too? Oh, no, yeah, no, it's just that, oh, I hate when, like, people segregate into sexes and stuff. It's like, you know, you're trying to ask for, like, equal rights, you know, trying to, like, steer to, like, equal, you know. I just don't quite understand why is that we're even, like, trying to, like, take this in consideration. Because
Trying to take what into consideration? Just
the fact that they have had a criminal history or something, like, they got caught, you know, based off of this system that we put in place that we were supposed to, like, correct these individuals, put them in the correctional center. We said, okay, you know, judge said, okay, I'm gonna give you this many years, you're gonna do this many years for this crime. Isn't that the payment that they have to do? Why do we have to, like, give them more restrictions or, like, hold them back even more by preventing them getting into a school?
Well, to be clear, though, the way that FIU is asking the question and what FIU is looking for is not necessarily just those people that have been through their conviction, you know, have had their trial, they've been convicted, they've been in jail, and now they're released. we're also looking at those people who are maybe currently going through trial or maybe currently on probation. And so maybe they didn't serve any prison time at all, but they're still on probation. And so the question that we ask is to get at both of those things, not just like one or the other. So just to be a little bit clear.
Both of the things, but like, even if they're in the middle of it, they got caught, you know, and they're in the middle of it and they're going through a process, they're being told, you know, you're gonna do certain amount of time or whatever, you're gonna serve the consequences. If those consequences are not good enough, then shouldn't that be the major priority, like, concern? Because once a person has been, let's see.
You're saying like they've gotten like they've done what they're supposed to do, so why impose further kind of sanctions
Or for those
on
that
them?
are currently doing it, you know, they're currently going through the process of paying the consequences. Why do we still have to like keep on, you know, they're paying the consequences?
In the purple, you had your hand up, and then the gentleman on either side.
I think that was probably the last.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So just the. Oh yeah, it's 1:30. Sorry. Okay. Well, wow, time went by so fast. Well, thank you guys so much. I'm free to stay here and talk to you all afterwards if anybody wants to come up and you have more questions or just want to know a little bit more about the process. But thank you guys so much for engaging in the conversation. We really appreciate that.
Definitely. Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation.
Produced by Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.